like just on a national scale, if Kamala Harris wins in November, you're going to have a whole lot of red states and rural conservative people that are ready to tear their hair out and say, I don't know how we're supposed to live in this country. We're so different, and vice versa. We all know what's going to happen if Trump wins re-election. You're going to have the same exact thing in reverse in blue states. People saying, we can't live under this, we got to find better solutions. We got to find different ways so that we can get people government that makes sense for them and allow those of us that are different to just be different. And I think the country is ready for some solutions. Regardless of what happens in November, people are going to be looking for some solutions to lower the political tension, because we all know there's going to be political tension after November. So they're going to be looking for alternatives, and we're here. We've laid the groundwork. We're ready to provide that.
Hey there, friends. Welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on Yanasa TV. Today, I have a very special guest for you. But before we get into the interview, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about being in an arranged marriage, one that's lasted for years. But you had nothing in common with your spouse. You didn't even know your spouse. You and your spouse live completely different lifestyles. Your values are different. Your morals are different. It's nothing against the other person. The marriage was arranged. But you're stuck in this marriage. But what ends up happening over time is because you have different values, because you have different morals, because you have a different way that you want to live your life, your spouse slowly takes over the reins. That spouse slowly gains more and more control over your household to the point that you no longer have a voice, you no longer have a say. Some people in this country, many of you, would probably say that that could be an abusive relationship. Most of you would probably say it's time to get a divorce if you can't work it out. Either way, it is a very unhealthy situation. Imagine if you did try and work it out, and you tried, and you tried, and you tried, but because your spouse had become so powerful, they no longer even bothered listening to you. They completely ignored you. And in fact, they made your life even worse. Imagine that they restricted you so much that your own economic welfare became dependent upon them. Now what do? You're stuck. And the only way that you can get divorced from this particular individual is if you have their permission to get divorced. But this individual loves having the power and control that they have over you. They don't want to let you go. They don't want to let the house go that you grew up in, that your family built. I think a lot of people at this point in time in our country can feel that way sometimes, depending on where they live. It is arguable that when hopelessness goes too far, it can turn into violence. But the guest on my show today has a different solution. I'd like you to hear what he has to say about a situation going on in Oregon.
My name is Matt McCaw. I'm the executive director for the Greater Idaho Movement, and I'm a lifelong Oregonian, small business owner. My wife and I are foster parents. We have 8 children. We live in Central Oregon now, but I was raised in Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon, went to university over on the west side of the state, lived in the Portland metro area for 20 years, working and building my career, and then have moved back to the east side of the state. So I'm a lifelong Oregonian, and I know the state just like everybody else who's lived here forever knows the state. The east side of the state is different than the west side of the state. There's always been this urban-rural divide in Oregon, where the east side is very conservative. It has a different geography, a different economy, different culture than the west side. And so that's been true for as long as I've been alive. What happened in the state of Oregon is that when I was a kid, 40 years ago, growing up, the state of Oregon was a purplish state. We would have a Democratic governor. We would have a Republican legislature. So there was this divided government. There was representation for both sides of the state. Both sides of the state, the urban parts in Northwest Oregon and the rural parts in Eastern Oregon felt like they had some sort of political voice. What's happened over the last 20, 30 years in Oregon is it is tipped over where it's no longer a divided government state. It's no longer a purplish state. It's a deep blue state where those urban areas have grown so much and so fast and vote so overwhelmingly Democratic that our entire legislature is Democratic. Every statewide held office is Democratic. And so those of us that live out here on the east side of the state, the conservative part of the state, we don't have any political representation or any political voice in our own state. And so where at one time it felt like we had some voice, some power, that no longer exists. So how did I get involved in this movement? I'm a lifelong Oregonian who has known about this problem for my whole life. And when I heard about the Greater Idaho Movement, it clicked. I said, that's brilliant. Like I had the reaction that most people do. That makes all the sense in the world. I mean, my first reaction was, can you do that? Can you move a state line? Because I think that we've been conditioned to think that the way the states look is the way the states look. And that's just the way it is. And that's set in stone. But that's not the reality at all. In fact, the founders understood that states would move borders. A border is a political tool. You use it to group similar peoples. That's what they're there for, is for political representation. And so just because this border has been here for 170 years doesn't mean that it's somehow sacred and has to stay that way. It's a tool that we can use to place wherever it makes the most sense, wherever it's the most beneficial for the people that it's supposed to be serving. So when I heard about the idea, I said, that's brilliant. This solves the problem. Western Oregon is very left-leaning. They want left-leaning government. They want left-leaning policy. Moving the border to the Cascade Mountain Range would allow Western Oregon to continue to get the left-leaning policy they want, but it would allow the people in Eastern Oregon who never vote for any of that kind of policy. Every statewide referendum that comes up that gets passed by Western Oregon, the Eastern Oregon counties vote the complete opposite. They vote against it, but it gets forced on them. Statewide offices, they vote. Eastern Oregon votes Republican, overwhelmingly Republican, 75% Republican. But we never win any statewide offices. The people that we vote for never win because Eastern Oregon only makes up 9% of the population. And there's no way to overcome the population advantage that Northwest Oregon has. So when I heard about this, I said, that's a great idea. It's something that I am willing. I was never involved in politics. I was just your typical, person running my business, raising my family, going to church, trying to give back to my community. But politics was not something that I was involved in. When COVID happened, that changed my perspective on things. And I realized when COVID happened, like a lot of people, that if I didn't get involved politically, that my kids were not going to grow up in the same state, the same country, the same, have the same opportunities and upbringing that I did. And so when I heard about this idea, I said, that's a great idea. It solves a problem. It's a peaceful political solution and it works. It's a win-win for everybody involved. I can get behind that. So I just called up and started volunteering. And now 3 years later, I've moved up. I'm now the executive director. And, this movement only started in 2019. And we've gone from 2019, a small group of people sitting around a table at a pizza place talking about how to solve the urban-rural divide in Oregon, to now 4 years later, we've had 13 out of the 17 counties we're looking to move, vote, and pass measures asking their elected leaders to move this forward. We've had the Idaho House already pass a memorial saying that they are open and ready to begin conversations on border relocation with the state of Oregon whenever the state of Oregon is ready. So we've made amazing progress and gotten, so far down the road of making this happen in 4 short years. And it's a testament to how good the idea is. And it's a testament to how much people want change, positive change that makes their lives better.
With the percentage of registered voters, you have 25% of registered voters in Oregon in this part of the, Oregon. Probably 80% of the state has 25% of the voters. Do you have support from people outside of that voting populace that also think, this is probably better for the state of Oregon?
Yeah. So there was some surveys, some polling done in, I think it was January of 2022. And they asked people across Oregon, Northwestern Oregon. So we know that the people in Eastern Oregon support our proposal. And because we've gone to votes in 13 counties and the people in 13 counties have said, yes, we want our elected leaders to look into this. We want our elected leaders to pursue moving the border. And we know that there's support in Idaho because there was polling that was done in Idaho in 2021. And they asked Idahoans, if Eastern Oregon counties vote to join your state and they could become part of your state, and not be an economic burden on the state of Idaho, should we let them come in? And Idahoans said over 2-1, absolutely, yes. Like that makes sense. That makes sense for Idaho. So we know there's support in Idaho. We know there's support in Eastern Oregon. And there was even polling done by Survey USA in Western Oregon. And it asked people, it asked them lots of questions, but at the end, they said, if people in Eastern Oregon, in counties out there, vote to leave our state, should we let them leave? And it wasn't over 50%, but it was more people said, yes, we should let them leave than said, no, we shouldn't. And then there was a chunk of undecided. So this is a popular idea, and it's an idea that makes sense. Out here in Oregon, people know the urban-rural divide exists. They know that the east side of the state is completely different than the west side of the state. It always has been. From the very beginning when Oregon's border was formed, the people that lived on the east side of the state advocated for the border to be placed at the Cascade Mountain Range. Because even 170 years ago, it was obvious that Western Oregon was going to develop differently than Eastern Oregon. And it didn't make sense for those two sides to be grouped together in a state. It made far more sense for Eastern Oregon to be grouped with Idaho, which is more like us in every way, economically, socially, geographically, climate-wise. So people understand the problem out here, and they understand why this solution makes sense. And honestly, of all the things that are dividing us across our country right now, most people still agree on one thing, and that's that people should have self-determination. People should have a right to vote in the government that makes sense for their communities. And we see that in Western Oregon, people believe that. Eastern Oregon, people believe that. And so do people in Idaho.
Don't you kind of have to have both the Oregon legislator and Idaho both agree to the border change? But you've already got kind of heavy representation from the Northwest in the legislature. So how do you convince them to go? I mean, I could see Idaho maybe going along with it. You know, there's probably some questions there, but how do you convince, all the Democrats to say, yeah, we'll let you guys go? Because in my perspective, and I'm not in Oregon, but my perspective is they want the land. They just don't want you guys there, So how do you convince them to let you move the border 200 miles west?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Charlie. And it's the most common thing that we get is that they'll never let you go, which is really a sad commentary on our politics. It's a sad commentary that we believe that our politicians, rather than looking at what is the best long-term solutions to get people government that makes sense for them and that they want for their communities, it's really a power tug of war between the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. But we all kind of know that that's true. And that's why people say, well, they'll never let you go. Well, there's a lot of good reasons why they should let us go. For one, it would economically benefit Western Oregon. So Western Oregon is urban. Western Oregon has a different economy than the Eastern Oregon kind of agricultural, natural resource-based economy. So Western Oregon is wealthier than Eastern Oregon. And so how that plays out is that Oregon collects taxes across the state and then redistributes those taxes. What ends up happening is Western Oregon ends up subsidizing Eastern Oregon. And it's not a small number. It's about $650 per person, per taxpayer per year. We're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that flow from the west side of the state to the east side of the state. So by letting Eastern Oregon go be part of Idaho, Western Oregon would keep all those tax dollars at home. And they could spend those on the problems that are specific to Western Oregon, the priorities that they have there. So there's a huge economic benefit. And just so that, because I know I will get questions, they'll say, well, if you're a drain on Western Oregon, why would Idaho want you? Well, Idaho would want us because, again, Eastern Oregon is similar to Idaho, where Eastern Oregon is not as wealthy as Western Oregon. We're actually as wealthy, if not wealthier, than the state of Idaho. So we're very similar economically. We're very similar culturally. So we could become part of Idaho. Idaho could take in these Eastern Oregon counties, and not only would it not be an economic drain on Idaho like it currently is on Oregon, our counties would be a boost to the state of Idaho, to their tax revenue. So again, it's a win-win. It's a win for Western Oregon. It's a win for the state of Idaho. It's definitely a win for the people of Eastern Oregon. So there's that aspect. Western Oregon also could end gridlock in the state of Oregon. So Oregon has this urban-rural divide. The east side of the state only elects Republicans, and the southern part of the state mostly elects Republicans. The northwest part of the state mostly elects Democrats. So although Oregon is a supermajority, oftentimes Democrat legislature, Republicans do have some tools to stop Democratic legislation. So people that are familiar with the state of Oregon may know about the walkouts we've had. So in Oregon, basically the only power that Republicans have left is to just not show up to the legislature, to walk out and just shut everything down. So there is a certain amount of gridlock that still happens in Oregon. That could be done away with. If you let Eastern Oregon and the Eastern Oregon representatives and senators who are Republican join Idaho, which is 80% Republican, and allow them to become part of the majority in a state that much better matches their citizens, then the people in Western Oregon wouldn't have to worry about gridlock. They wouldn't have to worry about the policy that they want getting implemented in their part of the state, because they would have supermajorities again, and they could implement the policy that makes sense. And Charlie, that's really what this movement is all about. We understand, sometimes we get accused of stoking partisanship. Greater Idaho didn't create the partisan divide in our country. What we understand is that there is a massive partisan divide, and there's a massive separation of cultures. The things that the people in Portland, Oregon want for their communities are vastly different than the people in Eastern Oregon want for our communities. And that's not going to change. It's only gotten more, that gulf has only gotten wider over time. And we don't foresee that, we don't foresee that gulf narrowing anytime soon. So how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with the fact that our urban populations, not just in Oregon, but across the country, really, our urban populations want things like gun control and legalized drugs, and they want to go light on criminality and abortion up till birth in Oregon. That's what we do here, and LGBTQ and transgenderism and all these things that our urban centers seem to want. The people there want those. That's the kind of policy they want. But that's antithetical to what the people in rural communities want. So
right.
Are we going to just play, it's just a total power tug of war? And when rural areas have control, they're going to force their policies on urban areas. And then when urban areas are in control, they're going to force their policy on rural areas. We don't think that's a good path forward for this country. And we don't see that as productive. We see that as only causing political tension. You cannot force values and policy on people that don't want them, don't agree with them, without causing conflict. So we got to find a better way to allow people to lower conflict. And we think that's by using the tools we have, the peaceful political tools like border relocation, to allow people in places like Eastern Oregon, where we're a political minority that's having policy forced on us by people that don't share our values and are nothing like us and want completely different things for their communities, allow people like us to get government that actually makes sense for us.
And the other thing you have to think about is with Oregon, or Northwestern Oregon, they have a lot of programs and issues like getting homeless off the streets that they don't have the funding for right now. So, I mean, some of these ideas do sound like they would benefit Northwestern Oregon with their ideals, at least within the cities of what they want to accomplish. In my opinion, from watching Kotek, she's heavily funded by environmental groups. And I think that they kind of look at, the state of Oregon as a rewilding project in many ways. Like if we can get more control of the BLM lands, more control of these lands. So while everything you said makes perfect sense, there's still that thought process out there, just, kind of digging into that side. And I don't know if it's 100% true or not, but that's my opinion of what I've seen, where they still want the land. So, but that's the other thing is, why don't people in Eastern Oregon just pack up their bags and move?
Yeah. So that's, that's a great question. Why don't we just move if we want different representation? And the short answer to that is that the people in Eastern Oregon, many of us have lived here for generations. Many of us own our land out here. We own ranches and farms that have been in our families for years. And even more importantly than that is that we have strong communities that we love. And the people out here in Eastern Oregon, we don't have a problem with our local church and our local schools and our local community. These are strong communities that are great, like-minded people for the most part. What we have a problem with is a state government that's run by people that live hundreds of miles away with radically different values than us and a very different worldview than us, that forces policies on our communities that we believe is harming our communities. And so we shouldn't have to move to get governance that the vast majority of people who live here actually want. So you go back, you said, why would they ever let you go? And I gave you a couple of reasons that were, common sense. Like, if I'm going to, list pros and cons, here's why you should let us go. And they're very valid and they're very good. And we've been making that case for 3 or 4 years. But the other thing that is a reason they should let us go is because it's the right thing to do. And most people understand that it's the right thing to do. Most people in our country, again, with all the things that divide us, most people still believe that democracy matters and that the people that live in an area should have the final say in what kind of government they have. And that when a group of people is no longer happy in an association, that you don't force those people to stay against their will because you let them go. And what's happened in the state of Oregon is Eastern Oregon has been grouped into Oregon for 170 years. And if you go back to when that border was first put there, the people in Eastern Oregon said, we don't want to be part of Oregon. That doesn't make sense. And they were outvoted by the Western Oregon delegates at the original Oregon Constitutional Convention. So for 170 years, this group of people, this massive area of land. I mean, it's bigger. Eastern Oregon is bigger than multiple states. This isn't a small piece of land we're talking about. And it's not an insignificant amount of people. We're talking 400,000 people. The entire state of Wyoming is only 600,000 or 700,000 people. So this isn't a small group of people. We've been in this association with Western Oregon for 170 years. And throughout that history, there have been times when our interests have aligned with Western Oregon. And there's been times where we've had political power and an ability to have a say in our state that made sense for us. But for the last 30 years, we have not. And the interests of Western Oregon no longer align with the interests of Eastern Oregon. Eastern Oregonians are saying, this does not work for us anymore. And we don't want to take anything from you. We don't want to force anything on you. We're just done with the state of Oregon. And we think that our communities would be better. Our lives would be better if we got governance from the state of Idaho. Most people understand that that's not a crazy idea. That's a perfectly reasonable and valid idea. And that to keep people who've said, we're not happy and we just want to peacefully leave, to hold those people against their will is wrong. And most people understand that. And so part of what we need is our Democratic legislators in Western Oregon to feel that pressure that, hey, these people are voting and just saying, hey, we just peacefully want to join this other state because this isn't the policies you're forcing on us. The way you're dealing with us isn't working. And so we're not going to ask anything of you. Just let us go. And we need to have those elected leaders feeling the pressure. Well, why aren't you? Why is it that these people, even though they're all voting to leave, why are you holding them against your will? How is that not the wrong thing to do? And I think that kind of social pressure and cultural pressure can be important and could be, maybe even what helps get them to the point of saying, you know what, you're right. This is wrong. This does look bad. This is not what we don't want people to identify us as the kinds of people that hold people against their will when they've said, hey, we just want to peacefully leave.
Hopefully, that appeal of, hey, look, we don't have anything against each other. We just don't have the same livelihoods. And because of that, in many ways, that's probably creating a bigger drag on Oregon, because if you took Eastern Oregon and you moved it over to Idaho with their policies, it seems to me like there would almost be an economic boom in Eastern Idaho as far as livelihoods go.
Absolutely. There was an economic analysis done by an independent consulting group in 2022. And they looked at what would happen if Eastern Oregon counties joined Idaho. And what they found is exactly what you just said. Those Eastern Oregon counties getting out from Oregon policy, getting out from Oregon environmental and regulatory policy for businesses, they predicted that Eastern Oregon County economies would surge, that people would take off. They also predicted that there would be a massive amount of people, because Western Oregon is still, 3 million plus people. There's a lot of conservatives that live in Western Oregon. Just because there's so many people that live there, they predicted there'd be a massive amount of people that would move now to Eastern Oregon. If Idaho policy instead of being 6 hours away from Western Oregon, was only 2.5 hours from Western Oregon, you'd see a lot of conservative people in Western Oregon say, hey, we're going to move. We're going to get that different policy. And there would be nothing wrong with that. And that's exactly, again, this is the way our politics is supposed to work. It's supposed to match up people to the government that they actually want. It's not supposed to end up in situations where a majority can force things on a minority of people that don't want them, and force policy onto people that don't make sense for them. So Greater Idaho is a movement. It's a self-determination movement that is exactly what people say they want out of politics. And that is peaceful political solutions that solve problems, create wins for people. That's what we do. And it's why that we've been so successful, why we poll so well in Oregon, Western Oregon, and Idaho, why we win votes when we go to votes in Eastern Oregon. It's a good idea.
When you're talking about voting rights and having a voice, that's what we have the Electoral College for, so that everybody gets represented. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't sound like it's working in Oregon. Has something changed in Oregon over the last 30 years?
Yeah. So there used to be that every county had a state senator. So if you had a county, and it functioned as an electoral college for rural areas. The whole purpose of the electoral college is so that rural areas have representation and that they don't get overwhelmed by the population centers. The reason why Wyoming gets 2 senators, just like California, is because Wyoming is never going to have the population that California is going to have. And Wyoming has specific interests that are specific to Wyoming that deserve to be protected and deserve to have representation, just like California does. So there was a time when in a place like Oregon, you had state senators for every county. And so there's, 17 rural Eastern Oregon counties out of 36 total counties in Oregon. So right there, you would have, mass representation for rural counties that they don't have now. A lawsuit was filed and the Supreme Court ruled that you could no longer do that at the state level, that you had to have equal representation for senators. You couldn't have a senator from a county with 5,000 people versus one senator from a county with 800,000 people. So it did away with that. So now we have, out of the 30 senators in Oregon, what we have is 3 that represent Eastern Oregon, and the other 27 represent Western and Southern Oregon. So there is no electoral college type representation for Eastern Oregonians, for rural Oregonians now in the state of Oregon, because of that Supreme Court ruling that happened decades ago. And even if that Supreme Court ruling were to be undone, it's hard to see how Western Oregon would allow the state to go back to the system that it had before. If they're not going to allow us to move the border and leave the state, it's hard to see how they would ever allow us to have, go from 3 senators back to 17.
When you look at it on a national scale and you take, 200 miles worth of land and move it over to Idaho, is it going to change the national electoral college?
So one of the reasons why our proposal makes so much sense. We could have done a lot of things. We could have said, well, we want to be our own state. And there's plenty of places, there's plenty of movements like that are going around saying we want a state of Jefferson or the state of, Northern California or Eastern Washington or that is a path that we could have taken. One of the reasons why I chose to get involved in the Greater Idaho movement is because moving the border is relatively simple. It's a relatively simple process that doesn't require or doesn't upset the apple cart of federal elections. So Eastern Oregon has about 400,000 people. So if we moved those 400,000 people into the state of Idaho, it most likely would move 1 representative, federal House representative, from Oregon to Idaho. And then it would make Oregon go from having 6 representatives to down to 5, and Idaho going from 2 representatives up to 3. So that would be 1 electoral college vote out of the 538 that currently exist. It's very, very small. Like it would have very, very, very little national impact on federal elections. And we all know just how partisan our country is. They wouldn't, anything that Democrats on a nationwide scale think is going to hurt them, they're not going to go for. Anything that Republicans on a national scale think is going to hurt them long-term, they're not going to go for. So we needed to find a proposal that did not impact federal elections much at all. And our proposal does that. Again, what it does is it takes those 400,000 people and gets them representation that makes sense for them, moves them into a state that much better matches their values, and it solves a problem. And it solves a problem without impacting a whole bunch of other people or the national scene, but creates these wins for the two states involved and the people in Eastern Oregon.
What about things like water rights? I know that's a big deal in Oregon, and as we've seen this year, it's a very big deal in Idaho. In fact, they still don't have a solution in Idaho. But some of those areas kind of overlap. Right now, they're separate states. But how would that be handled, moving everybody over to Idaho?
Yes. So the process for moving a state line, just to be clear with everybody, is that any two states can change their border. And that's been the process since the country began. It's happened multiple times throughout the history of the country. Oregon and Washington moved their border in 1958. And it's through this process called an interstate compact, which is essentially the two states come together. They draw up a contract. They say where the border isn't making sense. So we're going to move it to here. And here's the policies that are going to change. And here's what's going to be grandfathered in. And here's what's going to happen with all these changes. And when the two states agree on that contract, they sign it. And it's done. It goes to Congress for approval, which historically Congress has approved interstate compacts at a very high rate. Because again, if there's so little federal impact, why would Congress people from the East Coast, if an Oregon, blue state, Idaho, red state decide that it makes more sense to move their border here, it's hard to see why people that live thousands of miles away would see a problem with that. So that's the process. Water rights is going to be one of those things that the two states are going to have to figure out. Now, the good news is, and you're right, water rights is vastly important out here in Eastern Oregon and Idaho because we don't have a lot of water. And so it's you don't have water, you're not growing anything. These are dry climates. And so the good news is that Oregon and Idaho have very similar water rights law on the books. And it's, essentially the first come, the person who's had the water right the longest takes priority over the junior water rights holder. And then along with that is that you have to be using that water. You can't just claim water and then not be using it. You have to be growing crops with it or using that water. So the systems are very, very similar. So most likely what would happen is when Eastern Oregon goes to join West or Idaho, that those water rights would fall under the same system. There would most likely be no change whatsoever in a vast majority of people's water rights. Now, could there be some, we have one system here on what would be the western part of Idaho where we have water that comes from a reservoir that's, what could potentially still be part of Oregon that then flows into what would potentially then be part of Idaho. That would have to be worked out. And there would have to be some agreement, again, between the two states. States do these sorts of things all the time. It wouldn't have to be complicated, but people get very nervous about water rights. But the reality is that the system in Idaho is almost identical to the system in Oregon, and there's no reason to think that people's water rights would change in any meaningful way.
When you're talking about all of this, and you're talking about water rights from shared reservoirs and everything else, how much is it going to cost the state of Idaho to take that large portion of Oregon?
So the economic analysis that was done did not put a number on that. And there have been numbers that have been bandied about by various people, but we can't see none of those have been backed up by anything other than just somebody's wild guess. So there are assets in Eastern Oregon. There is a lot of land, but most of the land of Eastern Oregon is federally owned. It's not owned by the state. It's either federally owned or it's privately owned. So like Idaho, Eastern Oregon is, vastly majority of it is federal property. And then there's a lot of private property. The state actually owns a very, very small percentage of Eastern Oregon, 1 or 2%. And that's, things like Eastern Oregon University or a state prison, land where people are. There's a wildlife refuge. So those are assets that there's going to have to be some sort of, exchange with. But the other thing to remember, Charlie, is that the people of Eastern Oregon make up 9% of the population. So they've been paying 9% of the taxes. They own 9% of the assets of the state of Oregon. It wouldn't make any sense for the 9% of the people of Eastern Oregon to leave Oregon and leave all the assets that they've helped pay for over the last, 170 years behind. So what we recommend or what we propose is that you start with that 9% as a baseline. Eastern Oregon makes up 9% of the population. So Eastern Oregon would assume 9% of the debt obligations of Oregon and 9% of the assets of Oregon. And if you do that, there's no reason to think that the state of Idaho would necessarily have to spend anything to get Eastern Oregon, because Eastern Oregon might have more assets coming in than what it would cost to pick up that very small percentage of things that are currently owned by the state.
Right. And it's kind of an investment, because if you get an economic boom out of Eastern Oregon because all of a sudden the policies change, then, I mean, that part makes a lot of sense. It's a good investment.
But absolutely. It makes a ton of sense for Idaho, and which is why we've had such an easy, we went to the Idaho legislature and we passed the House, and it was not a close vote, and we polled super well, because for Idaho, they're getting land, resources. Most importantly, they're getting 400,000 like-minded citizens that have the same values as they do. They want the same things for their communities. They vote the same way, want the same kind of government. It pushes Oregon law far away. It gives Idaho room to grow. Idaho's been exploding. Anybody who's been to Boise and Meridian sees just, houses just going up left and right, because people are pouring into the state of Idaho to get the conservative governance that Idaho offers. This gives Idaho room to grow. People don't have to move to Boise. They can move to Eastern Oregon. They can move to Central Oregon, which is beautiful, has lots of land and lots of space, and still get that conservative governance that people are looking for.
My wife, actually, when we were looking at places to live, was pulling up, places in Oregon. And I was like, we're not moving to Oregon. But I mean, then she found the Greater Idaho movement. And so when you contacted me, I was like, sure, let's talk. Because, that was one of her selling points to me, was maybe we can get there and then they'll get it done. What do you think the timeline is on getting something like this done?
Yeah, so the timeline is, as soon as we get 51% of the Oregon legislature to agree to begin border talks with Idaho, that's kind of when this process can start. And we would see from that point, you're going to have a year of studies being commissioned, a year or two, and research being done, developing a contract. That could take a year or two. And then that we would propose, and what we suggest is that once that contract's in place, because what we've been doing is we've been asking voters, and going to them and saying, do you like this idea? Do you want your elected leaders to pursue it? And people are saying yes, overwhelmingly. We're 13 for 13 in Eastern Oregon. Most of our votes aren't close. But once we have that contract in place, once we know those details that we can't necessarily provide now, but will be hashed out between the two state legislatures on things like water rights, on minimum wage, on cannabis laws, because Idaho and Oregon have vastly different cannabis laws. And so once those details are in place, we would suggest or propose that goes back to a vote of the people in Eastern Oregon. And if they still agree that, yes, this is what we want, then it could happen. I mean, as soon as the Oregon legislature is ready to have these talks, the process doesn't need to take more than a year or two to actually make it happen. But it's all on hold until the Oregon legislature is willing to have this conversation with the state of Idaho.
How many of them are willing now, percentage-wise, do you think?
We had a memorial. So in 2023, when we went to the Idaho House, we had a memorial, which invited the Oregon legislature, formally invited them to begin border talks with the state of Idaho. That passed the Idaho House. It went to the Senate. The Senate said, let's wait and see what Oregon does before we, move this bill. We have other priorities. If Oregon's up for it, then we'll take it up. So it kind of stalled out in the Senate. We had a similar memorial in the Oregon Senate. We had one sponsor and one co-sponsor. And so we approached, dozens and dozens of representatives and senators and asked them to sponsor this bill and to advocate for what people were saying they wanted. And we got one sponsor and one co-sponsor. And so that's out of 30 senators and 60 representatives in the state of Oregon. So we have a problem. And our problem is that our representatives, our elected leaders at the state level, are not advocating for what voters are saying they want. And it's not just a Democrat problem. Eastern Oregon has 5 representatives and 3 senators out here that represent people, the very people that are voting for this and saying we want this to happen. And our own representatives and senators are not picking up the issue and advocating for us. So right now we're a long ways, and we need to make a lot of progress. But every time we get a chance to get on programs like this and let people know what's happening and explain why this makes sense and why our elected leaders and even explain how elected leaders are not doing what voters are asking them to do, it gives us a chance to leverage some more pressure and get those people on board. We're hoping in this next session that we go from one sponsor and one co-sponsor to an entire Eastern Oregon block where they all say, hey, this is what our voters want, and we're going to advocate for that. And imagine if all of the representatives and senators who represent us actually advocated for what we wanted rather than ignoring it, hoping it goes away, whatever currently is happening.
No, it hasn't gone away yet. It's
not going to, and it's not going to go away, Charlie, because the problem isn't going away. And that was, what I was mentioning earlier. We've got to figure something out in this country. If Kamala Harris, like just on a national scale, if Kamala Harris wins in November, you're going to have a whole lot of red states and rural conservative people that are ready to tear their hair out and say, I don't know how we're supposed to live in this country with open borders and transgendered this and tampons in boys' bathrooms. And, we're so different, and vice versa. We all know what's going to happen if Trump wins re-election. You're going to have the same exact thing in reverse in blue states. People saying we can't live under this, we got to find better solutions. We got to find different ways so that we can get people government that makes sense for them and allow those of us that are different to just be different and live our lives without interference from the other side.
I mean, it is kind of, we are kind of in a weird state right now where it feels like each side is trying to tell the other side how they need to live their lives to be like them. It's no longer a country where, we're voting on, policies that matter economically, or these, we have a lot of social issues that I just don't even think should be being handled on the national scale. They should be community, led issues. But, it feels like if we can figure out a way to allow people to be represented better, a lot of that would change. But looking at, for example, what happened in Oregon, and it's happened in other states where the electoral colleges are changed. People are constantly fighting over, rerouting districts to get more power. Eventually, you're going to have a group of people that don't have a say anymore. And that's not what the country was about in the first place. So you guys want to take a section of the state away. Is there any animosity that you guys feel directly from the state of Oregon for having this movement? Like, do they look at you as enemies and treat you that way, or are they pretty, understanding of your movement?
Well, if you could see my inbox, Charlie, you'd know that there's some people that are pretty upset, and they do see it as that we're stealing part of the state away. But at a state level, elected leader level, we haven't sensed that animosity. Our elected leaders at the state level have basically said, so our Senate president in 2023, when we introduced that memorial, we did have a sponsor and co-sponsor that put that into the state Senate, and the Senate president said, we're not interested. We're not moving this. The governor has said that she's not interested in dealing with this. We have an open invitation to the governor of Oregon, Governor Kotek, to sit down with us, wherever, whenever, and talk about how we can get Eastern Oregon better representation. But it's been civil, which is good. But there are people, of course, that are upset, and there's tensions are high, and people are passionate. And, what we're trying to do is find peaceful ways to solve these differences and peaceful ways to get better governance for people before tensions do boil over, and I think what you're seeing in the country is, I think you're going to see red states get redder, and you're going to see blue states get bluer. I think that's what we've been seeing over, the last 10 years. Ever since, frankly, ever since Donald Trump came on the scene, it seems like the partisanship and the kind of just like, we can't tolerate each other, we can't live with each other. It's just, really, we've gotten very, very polarized. And so we got to figure out a way to lower that political tension, in a peaceful way. That's what politics is: peacefully deciding our arguments so that you don't have to do it, through conflict. And so ideas like ours, political solutions, a border is just an imaginary line. It's a political tool that we use all the time. We redistrict every 10 years, and we take this imaginary line and we draw it around a bunch of people and say, because this represents this group of people. We do that all the time. We could do that with states, and we could lower political tension, get better governance, and solve problems.
If there weren't political parties, I'm an independent myself, but I mean, my votes tend to go one way because I vote on issues, and
Sure.
I look for the best representation of my issues. But if there weren't political parties and there wasn't that bias out there that's controlling, everything, do you think this would be accomplished a lot sooner?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do, because I think that a good chunk of our politics these days, I don't think most people, as I get out and I talk to people, and I love being in this role because I get to travel around Eastern Oregon and go to Idaho and talk to people and meet lots of people. And I don't think most people view politics as my team versus your team. They view politics. Most people want to go to church, run their business, do their job, raise their family, watch their kids play sports, and just do the best things that make life worth living, right? That's what most people want to do. And politics is one of those things that they engage in because they need to make sure that they can do all those other things. And I think that's how most people kind of view politics. But for those people that are on the inside, those people that politics is their life, it very much is a blue team, red team, and everything's about clawing back as much power to either one of those teams as you can get. And when I talk and meet with representatives and senators, it almost always goes back to, well, our team needs to get this many seats, or we don't want to do anything to jeopardize maybe gaining a seat here or gaining a seat there. It's less about what do the people want, how do we better represent them, and more about how does our team get more power and win. And we're trying to avoid that. Like that's not what we don't see border relocation as a Republican issue. We see it as a self-determination issue. It's an issue that could work well for both, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And in fact, we'll get better governance for people on the west side of the state, which are very, very left-leaning and very liberal, couldn't be more opposite than me, but it will get better governance for them because they won't have people like me saying you can't do that. And so our idea is, in a very real way, a nonpartisan idea. It's about putting people in charge.
How would this impact? You're talking about how much of the land is federally owned anyway. So how would this impact agencies like BLM? Do you think that the state has any influence over how they handle their policies? Would it make things about the same or easier for people who have to work with Bureau of Land Management if that portion of Oregon went to Idaho?
Well, I'm sure, and I'm not super well versed in how much say the state of Oregon has on BLM policy, right? Like BLM is Bureau of Land Management. It's a federal agency. I'm not sure how much like the state of Oregon kind of directs what they do. But so I'm not exactly sure the answer to that. But what I can tell you is that if Eastern Oregon people have a certain value set, they have a certain way of looking at the world and what they want for our land out here. And it is much closer to what the people in in Idaho want for their land and their communities than what the people in Western Oregon do. So I'm not sure exactly how that would affect like the federal agencies that reside in Eastern Oregon, but I can tell you that getting any agency, if there's influence coming from Western Oregon, most likely that influence is not matching the values and the wants of the people that actually live out here. So getting any kind of influence for those agencies coming from Idaho rather than Oregon would be a positive for the people of Eastern Oregon. So Charlie, just you live on the East Coast, yes?
Yeah.
So how do you have such a good knowledge of what's happening out here? Because I've seen, our followers post your stuff every once in a while, and you seem very well understood on the issues that are happening out here. How do you have such a good knowledge base?
Well, my wife is from Colorado, and so
Okay.
she and I have always traveled east to west. We've spent the last 3 years working on a bison documentary. That's a poster behind me,
Okay.
and a lot of that is to educate people, about the importance of having ruminants on our landscape, especially those drier environments like Eastern Oregon, um, and so we've for the last 3 years we've been traveling mainly out west, up into Canada as well, to help people understand that. But somewhere along the line of in the last 8 years or so, because our work has taken us cross country and into Canada, I've followed a lot of different um, agricultural policies and things that are impacting small farmers. And I'm not one of those people who's like let's go till up all the land. I'm not, when it comes to farming, I'm not pro farming all the practices, but I think that a lot of times there's been a narrative that wants to shut down farms, which isn't the right answer to a lot of that either. I mean, I'm pro regenerative agriculture, all those things. So I started following more of those issues and um, speaking out against them, or speaking out about them, just to generate
Sure.
awareness. Sometimes I don't have an opinion one way or the other. But if it's an issue, um, I generally will talk about it. And so it's that kind of reporting, I guess, has kind of become a passion of mine on the side from the other work that my wife and I have done with, filming farms. And I can be a little bit of a libertarian sometimes. I know that, but I mean, my political views are kind of definitely more libertarian Republican than they are Democrat, but I also have a respect for everybody on all sides. And to answer your question a lot shorter, it's just kind of become a passion of mine to understand these areas and understand how certain policies are impacting people who live in those areas. I mean, rural communities really don't get a whole lot of representation
Right.
in a lot of places because of the population. But we're supposed to have this electoral college that is supposed to prevent the masses from
Yep.
controlling everything else. And they don't necessarily understand, if somebody living in a city doesn't understand everything going on in rural areas.
Right.
The vision that they're given a lot of the times is that farmers and ranchers are destroying these lands, and you know they're causing too many greenhouse gases, and they don't have a full picture of what is actually going on, the real stewardship of the land that is
Mhm.
going on. And we actually, my wife and I have that documentary is being done by a nonprofit we started to help educate people about agriculture, farmers, the rural communities, so that they can actually see and learn for themselves, what is good stewardship, what is, humane animal agriculture,
Mhm.
and hopefully correct some of the negative narratives that's been thrown out there. So while we are on the East Coast, my wife is, being from Colorado, her heart's always on the out west.
Yeah.
So we spend, I mean, over the last several years, we've spent probably most of our time out west.
Out west. Yeah.
So, and I haven't been to Oregon, but I've pretty much been all the way around it. So,
Yeah. Well,
um,
and Eastern Oregon is Idaho, and Idaho is Eastern Oregon. It's the
yeah,
same. Again, the geography is the same. If you look at like a satellite map, and you just look at like with no lines on it, you would
yeah,
never put the line around Oregon where it currently is. And it was all done like, we have an interesting thing on our webpage where there was some research that was done on how the line got there, how our border got there. And Idaho PBS Reports came out and did a story on it also. Essentially, Eastern Oregon got smashed in with Western Oregon because the people in Western Oregon wanted to have a bigger footprint on the map, and a
yeah,
bigger state. And people in Eastern Oregon were like, we don't want to be part of this. This doesn't make any sense. Your geography is completely different. Your climate, you're going to make a living different. You can support big amounts of people. We'll never support massive amounts of people out here in Eastern Oregon. It just, it just doesn't work. That's the way that the land is. And So it's, if you've been to Idaho, you've essentially been to Eastern Oregon. It's, we're similar, and which is why our proposal makes so much sense.
I mean, I hope it works out. Like I said, that's one of the areas my wife has been, like, I want to live out there. It's beautiful out there,
It is.
I mean, the truth is people forget that part of the country looks that way because of the people that are living there right now. That's so right. It's not like if you move to Idaho, suddenly you're going to have environmental degradation because you don't have the oversights of Oregon. Half of the environmental regulations that are coming out of Portland have alternative motives anyway, if you follow right. the financial trails to it. So they're not necessarily all that helpful either, so,
right.
And that's just part of something we kind of look at our network, our community as, those rural people, regardless of which state they're in. And that's who we support and reach out to. Especially nowadays when you have stuff like this, you can talk to somebody on the other side of the country. And
I know. Yeah. I know. It's crazy. Isn't it? Yeah. It's kind of crazy.
But, technology has its benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. So it's one of those things where, with your kids, you don't want them being programmed by an algorithm that's been programmed by, the minds of the masses. So
yeah, no kidding. Do you guys have kids in?
We do. We have one in college, one that just started high school, and one that's 8 years old. So they're spread out. We have a little bit of time in between each one going to college, but
okay, nice.
We homeschool because school systems are. We hit COVID, and you realize when your kids come home how bad the public education system is, because he'll sit there and our high schooler was always getting in trouble in school, and so when they started doing their in-home learning, we started picking up on the reasons why. He didn't read at his grade level. I mean, he just wasn't connecting with the teacher. Since he's been homeschooling, all of our kids are testing way above average. Our 8-year-olds like in the top 99 percentile or something. And it's just, but those are the types of things that, when I bring up even to siblings who live in cities, they're like, why don't you send your kids to public school? They're not getting socialized properly. And I'm like, they don't get socialized properly in a school either. Right. You put them in a room with a bunch of other people they don't have anything in common with, and you say, work on a project together. And that's kind of what they're doing with Oregon. They're putting a bunch of people in a state that have nothing in common with each other and saying, make a life out of it. You can't. You
can't. Exactly. And it's worse than you can't. It's that it causes tension. Like during COVID, I've never seen people so worked up. Like, I mean, because what happened was Oregon, super, liberal left side of Oregon, they closed all the churches down, closed all the schools down, closed businesses down. And then when they let some small schools, rural schools open up, everybody had to be in masks. And people over here hated it. Like they didn't want anything to, they hated it. So you just had open defiance. First of all, churches after about a month were like, forget this, we're meeting. I don't care what the state says. If they fine us, they fine us. You had school board meetings where you'd have, these are rural districts, like, like there's not that many people, and you'd have 150 parents show up and say, we're not putting our kids in masks. We're not doing this. I mean, it causes so much tension when these mismatched, worldviews, values try to force their way of life on the other. It's not just that it's not going to go, it's not going to work well. It's like, it causes tension. Like it causes anger and resentment and all the other things. So we got to figure out a way to get away from that,
Yeah. And I mean, having correct representation is probably the easiest way to do that. Let them hash it out on the Hill, but no, I appreciate you coming on and being able to share a little more about Greater Idaho. I know we have a lot of viewers that are in Oregon. And I also, so when I was looking at your website, there were questions about counties in Washington and counties in California as well. Have there been discussions about including counties from those other states into the project?
There have. So when this group started, it was actually before I was even involved, but when this group started, they just looked at voting patterns and said, where would it make sense? Eastern Washington and Oregon are very, very similar. The west side, in west side of Washington, you have King County, Seattle, 4 million people. It dominates everything statewide. East side of Washington is rural, conservative for the most part. Now, the one thing that is different about Washington is they have Spokane, which is a pretty big city that's, pretty liberal up on the border over there in Northeast Washington. We don't have anything like that in Eastern Oregon. Like, you get outside of Bend, there's just no big towns, period. And there's definitely no big liberal towns in Eastern Oregon. But we originally looked and said, hey, based on how people vote, it would make sense for Eastern Washington to be part of this too, or these Northern California counties. But one of the things that we've learned as we've gone through this process over the last 4 years is that just because people vote that way doesn't necessarily mean that they identify with Idahoans the way that Eastern Oregonians do. So we went to a vote in Southern Oregon, which Southern Oregon is a very conservative place. If you look at the way they vote very conservative. And so we went to Greater Idaho votes in 2 Southern Oregon counties, and we lost in both those counties. And we lost pretty handily in one county that is incredibly conservative. But what that told us was the people in Southern Oregon that are on the other side of the Cascades, they don't necessarily, identify with Idaho the way we do. For people in Eastern Oregon, for a lot of us out here in Eastern Oregon, Boise is closer than Portland or Salem. And when we have to do business, or have to fly or whatever, people go to Boise. They don't think about going to Portland. So they already do so much business and interact with Idaho that the people in Eastern Oregon, identify pretty closely with Idahoans. That's not necessarily the case for like Southern Oregonians. I don't know that would be the case for Northern Californians. And I don't know what the case would be for Eastern Washington. So because of that, because we lost those votes in Southern Oregon, we said, you know what, let's just scale this back. And let's just move these counties that we know for sure that's what the people want to do, and it's a good idea for them. And so we've kind of, we've scaled back and got just this Eastern Oregon counties that we want to move and are hopeful to do that. But once we're successful, I think it will open up the doors all across the country for this to happen. There's already, there was a Newsweek article that came out yesterday and talked about all the different movements similar to ours that are going across the country right now. And there's like 12 of them currently, because this urban-rural mismatch is not just unique to Oregon. It's all over the place, and you see it even in Colorado. There's, there's people that want to detach from Denver or kick Denver into another state, or, join, counties that want to join Wyoming. There's this understanding that like we're too different to be sharing government at this point. We need to get to people that are like-minded with us.
And you think ultimately if let's say the Greater Idaho movement prevailed and some of these other movements prevailed, do you think ultimately when people are able to live under a state governance that they can agree with, you're going to see more peace across the country, less, people trying to bash each other over the head every time there's an election?
100%. I 100% believe that this is the peaceful path forward, I believe. And people in Eastern Oregon. So, just for instance, people always see Oregon or they hear about Oregon and the first thing they think is Portland, and because they've seen some crazy news story about Portland or Antifa this, or, like something nuts out of Portland. The people in Eastern Oregon don't identify with Portland in any way, shape, or form. We're just like the rest of the country. We see what happens in Portland. We're just like, Portland, and whatever, that's Portland. It doesn't bother us that Portland is Portland until Portland comes out here and says, all this stuff that we do, now you have to do it. And then you have tension. And I think that's true of most places. Most people are more than happy to live and let live as long as their community is strong and they have the policy they want for their community. They're not worried about what's happening in San Francisco or Portland. They're happy to let them live their lives. But where you get the tension, where you get the conflict, is when you start having somebody say, well, no, you have to do this. And it goes against your values. And then, that's when the conflict happens.
Yeah.
So let's find ways to lower that. Let's find ways to get into less situations where we're doing that.
Yeah, makes sense. All right.
Hey,
Well,
Charlie, I really appreciate you having me on, and I'm glad
yeah.
that our listeners or our supporters, threw your name out there and said, this guy's good. You should, try to get on his show. And I appreciate you giving us an opportunity to talk about what we're doing. It's a tall task. It's a tall task. We understand that. But like I said, when I started this on this 3 years ago, I have friends and went to church with a fairly prominent politician in Oregon. And he was like, Matt, it's like, that's like a 1%. Don't even bother wasting your time. And I can tell you, I said, well, I'm going to try it anyways. I think it's a good idea. And I can tell you, I believe 100% that we're at a lot better chance of success than 1% now. And we've made a lot of progress, and we have a lot of momentum. People are seeing our solutions. And I think the country is ready for some solutions. Regardless of what happens in November, people are going to be looking for some solutions to lower the political tension, because we all know there's going to be political tension after November, whoever wins.
I mean, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. So they're going to be looking for alternatives, and we're here. We've laid the groundwork. We're ready to provide that.